Ukrainian drones targeted a bridge over the Hruski-Yelenchik River in Novozovsk, Donetsk region and hit Russian military trucks crossing it.
Russia had one route left to Crimea, one bridge, one narrow corridor through a choke point 5 to 7 kilometers wide that military planners had fortified since 2022 with dragon's teeth, anti-tank ditches, and multi-layered trench networks. 50,000 Russian troops in southern Ukraine and 60,000 more in Crimea depended on that corridor for every liter of fuel, every artillery shell, every ration that kept them in the fight. It was the last land connection between Putin's southern army and the peninsula he had spent a decade building into a fortress. Ukraine knew that. Ukraine had been building toward that moment for weeks. And on the night of June 10th to 11th, 2026, Ukrainian forces destroyed it too. 6 bridges, 48 hours, 110,000 Russian troops were cut off from their supply chain. This is the full breakdown of how Ukraine executed the most precise logistics isolation operation of the entire war, how a 2-strike sequence on the Chongar Bridge forced Russian convoys onto an alternate route, how Ukraine waited for that traffic to consolidate before hitting the Henichesk crossing, and how 4 simultaneous strikes on the Armiansk-Perekop line in a single overnight operation closed the last exit from Crimea before Russian engineers could build a bypass, and why every step Russia took to escape the trap pushed its forces deeper into it. The trap was not built in 48 hours. It was built over months. Ukraine's systematic bridge campaign against Crimea's logistics arteries began in earnest in May 2026, when Ukrainian drones established effective aerial control over the R280 Novorossiya highway, the land corridor running from Rostov-on-Don through Mariupol and Melitopol toward Crimea along the Sea of Azov coast. Over 125 Russian trucks were struck along the Crimean land bridge in May alone. By the end of the month, the R280 had become so dangerous for Russian convoys that the Russian command imposed a minimum speed limit of 120 kilometers per hour on military vehicles, using the route at night, not a maximum. A minimum in a desperate attempt to move faster than drone operators could track and engage. Russia was essentially ordering its own soldiers to drive at dangerous speeds in darkness to survive a road Ukraine had already turned into a hunting corridor. Fuel rationing had already begun in Sevastopol, customers restricted to 20 liters per person, as the fuel that was supposed to travel along the land bridge was burning on roadsides instead. The Russian-backed governor of the Kherson region had ordered the closure of part of the R280 on May 21st. Russian officials in the occupied territories were already looking for alternatives. But the R280 campaign was only preparation. It was softening the ground, exhausting Russian contingency planning, and forcing logistics planners to depend more heavily on the bridge crossings that Ukraine had already identified as its primary targets. The main event began on June 7th. The Chongar Bridge had carried approximately 60 to 70% of all traffic exiting Crimea toward the southern front. It was the most direct, most heavily used, and most vital logistics artery between Russian forces in Crimea and Kherson Oblast, the crossing that Russian generals had built their emergency resupply and evacuation plans around in case the R280 came under sustained pressure. That dependency made it the first domino. Ukraine's most elite units executed the operation. The Phalanx Multi-Domain Operations Center and the 475th Separate Assault Brigade, call sign code 92, carried out a joint operational plan. Experienced elements from the 1st Separate Assault Regiment, named after the legendary commander Dmytro Kochebailo, took on ground direction. Ukraine's special operations elements had spent weeks before the attack recording Russian patrol schedules and guard rotation patterns around the bridge via satellite surveillance. The radar systems, electronic warfare stations, and Russian air defense networks in the region had been studied for days. Ukrainian intelligence had identified the blind spots of the Panzer S-1 air defense batteries tasked with protecting the bridge, creating what the planners described as an essentially invisible air corridor for the incoming drones. Ukraine's FP-2 kamikaze drones executed the strike. These unmanned systems silently glided toward the bridge below Russian air defense radar range, manipulating electronic warfare frequencies in ways that made them appear on Russian radar screens as wind interference undetected until the final second. The Russian radars and sensors on duty detected the incoming threat far too late. The June 7th strike damaged the Chongar Bridge's roadway and forced Russian occupation authorities to suspend traffic through the nearby Jonkoy crossing point. The Russian command responded immediately by redirecting convoys through the Henichesk route, the alternate crossing connecting Henichesk with the Arabat Spit toward Crimea. That redirect was exactly what Ukraine had planned for, because the moment Russian logistics shifted to the Henichesk crossing, Ukraine had confirmation of something it needed before striking it: that Russia had committed its supply flow to the alternate route and had no immediate fallback prepared. Ukraine waited. Planet Labs satellite imagery published immediately after the strike showed massive impact marks on the bridge structure itself. The crossing connecting Henichesk to the Arabat Spit was closed. Traffic was blocked. Large convoys carrying BM-21 Grad multiple launch rocket systems and S-300 air defense munitions that had been moving toward the front were now sitting in front of a destroyed bridge with nowhere to go. The Russian command was directing every remaining convoy toward the last land connection, the Armiansk-Perekop line. The Perekop Isthmus has been known throughout military history as the narrowest and most critical gateway connecting Crimea to the mainland. Its width varies between 5 and 7 kilometers, a natural choke point where large-scale maneuvering is almost impossible. Russia had understood this vulnerability since annexing Crimea in 2014 and had spent years fortifying the corridor with dragon's teeth, anti-tank ditches, and multi-layered trench networks. The defenses were designed for infantry combat, not for sustaining the logistics flow of 110,000 troops simultaneously funneling through a 5-kilometer-wide strip of land. But with Chongar gone and Henichesk gone, the Perekop corridor was all that remained. Every Russian supply convoy in southern Ukraine and Crimea was now forced through this single narrow isthmus. The concentration of logistics traffic in one corridor gave Ukraine exactly the target density and geographic predictability it needed for the final phase of the operation. When everything must pass through one 5-kilometer gap, you know exactly where to strike. The operation began at midnight on June 10th and ran until 4:00 in the morning on June 11th. 4 hours. Despite Russian air defense systems being fully active across the region, Ukraine's FP-2 kamikaze drones slipped below radar range and reached their targets in a coordinated wave. Russian occupation governor Vladimir Saldo was forced to confirm the strikes publicly and identified the specific targets: 2 bridges over the North Crimean Canal near Preobrazhenka and Mirny, the main highway bridge on the Perekop-Armiansk axis connected directly to the M17 highway used by heavy military convoys, tanks, and fuel tankers, and the alternate bridge near the settlement of Stavki that had served as a backup crossing in case of congestion on the primary routes. 4 bridges. One night. Every remaining land route into Crimea was simultaneously closed. The immediate tactical consequences for Russian forces were cascading and severe. The 37th Motorized Infantry Brigade, which had been fed directly through the Chongar route and played a critical role on the southern front, was suddenly without supply lines. Russian positions in the Zaporizhia and Kherson directions were completely cut off from the steady flow of ammunition and fuel coming from Crimea. Artillery shells, tank spare parts, and soldier rations stopped reaching forward positions. Russian infantry engaged in heavy clashes with Ukrainian National Guard forces found themselves unable to call in the artillery support they needed because the ammunition chain behind that artillery had been severed at the source. The daily fuel requirements of heavy armored vehicles and artillery batteries requirements that had been barely met through multiple crossings when they were functional could no longer be satisfied through any land route. This is what logistics isolation looks like when it is executed correctly, not a single dramatic strike. A sequence each operation building on the previous one, each one forcing the enemy into a more predictable and vulnerable position, each one closing one more exit until no clean exit remains. Strike Chongar to force the shift to Henichesk. Strike Henichesk to force the shift to Perekop. Strike Perekop, and there is nowhere left to shift. Ukraine did not need to march an army across the 5-kilometer Perekop Isthmus to change the strategic situation in Crimea. It needed 48 hours, 6 bridges, months of preparation, and the patience to wait until Russia had committed its logistics to each successive route before closing it permanently. 110,000 troops. 6 bridges. 48 hours. The last route is gone. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of how Ukraine is cutting Crimea off from the war it needs to fight, share it. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The next one drops soon.